Hello, my name is Chuck Easley, and this is a talk about entrepreneurship, and I'm going to try and relate this to the Asian Life Sciences Hub. So overall, I want to talk about how entrepreneurship is intimately connected with three things: experimentation, calculated risk, and failure. And so I'm going to review several different research papers that myself and my co-authors and doctoral students have been working on and relate it to um, how entrepreneurship and innovation might be increased in the life sciences in the Asian countries. I'm currently a faculty member at Stanford University and affiliated with the Stanford Technology Ventures program. I've also kept one foot in the real world of entrepreneurship, spending the past decade in and around startup firms, founding three of my own, as well as working with two venture capital firms, Lux Capital and Flagship Ventures in the life sciences area. Before Stanford, I did my PhD at MIT Sloan, and prior to MIT, I worked at the Duke University Medical Center and founded my first startup venture, Sundance Genetics, while an undergraduate at Duke University. So all around the world, and including the US, there's a lot of interest in what can be done to help foster entrepreneurship. Here we see a recent very high-powered dinner that took place in the Woodside, California home of John Doerr from Kleiner Perkins. And so you can see President Obama on the right, flanked by Steve Jobs and Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook. A number of leaders of Silicon Valley were at this dinner, and Obama was asking about what policies could be implemented and what could be done to foster entrepreneurship and the growth of Silicon Valley firms. So here we see Obama, and we might imagine that he was asking about tips from Mark Zuckerberg of how to create a few million new jobs, and Zuckerberg might have responded with Farmville subsidies. But all joking aside, I think these industry leaders obviously have a lot of good insights, but they have perhaps a handful of examples from which to draw these. And so I think academics and scholars have a role to play as well in analyzing results from larger data sets and making inferences based on more systematic study. So what can we learn from recent research on startups and entrepreneurship? What I'm going to propose is that building successful startup ecosystems requires an environment that supports experimentation in the economy. And we can think of science as a map for that experimentation and for that R&D that can help guide it. And the other thing that I want to talk about in a bit of detail is how business models can similarly be a map for economic experiments. And that's how I think we should think of startups, is as experiments in the economy. So if entrepreneurship is fundamentally about experimentation, then what might that lead us to think about? This slide comes from Steve Blank, and he says that a startup is an organization that you use to search for a scalable, repeatable business model. So a startup is essentially about search. Once a repeatable business model is found, then the startup fundamentally changes into a transition phase where it's more about scaling up. And then a large company, which is really fundamentally different from a startup, is more about executing on a known business model. So the question for the entrepreneur is really which piece of the business model to hypothesize and test first. It could be about the partners, it could be about the customer segments, the value proposition, the right distribution channels. And although in life sciences, a great deal of the risk is around scientific risk. Will this molecule actually cure cancer or interfere in the disease process? There's still a lot of risk around the business model as well, and particularly if we start thinking about medical devices. But there are always business choices in terms of which market to target first, whether to use this scientific insight to develop a new drug, or whether it's better to first go after a diagnostic or a research tool that could be sold. And so the basic guidance here is to think about which aspect of the business model is riskiest and focus your experiments there. And so if the, say, FDA process is the riskiest, or whether the customer will actually want the product is the riskiest, then you want to focus on generating some low-cost experiments that you can run in that area of the business model. And so these experiments might be things as simple as going out and talking to 10 different customers, or they might be initiating meetings with 3 different potential partners, doing something beyond just sort of brainstorming in a conference room that will generate some data to give you feedback. So this is referred to as discovery-driven planning. In an area or in a market where you have a lot of uncertainty, you can't plan, you have to undertake some action and use discovery-driven planning. And so this experimentation, I've mainly been talking about it at the firm level, but experimentation for a successful startup ecosystem to develop, experimentation has to happen at a number of different levels. So in the life sciences, we're very familiar with experimentation at the scientific level, where you're experimenting with, say, molecules. But there can also be experimentation at the individual level, with potential users of the product, or just getting individuals to experiment and try out new things more. This could be at the employee level. You give your employees some flex time to experiment with new projects of their own. Experimentation can also be at the policy level, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But before I do, let me talk in a little bit more detail about how we might think about risk and experimentation at the firm level. So if we think about developing, and this actually comes from the business school case on Sirtus, if we think about developing a new drug, we might think at the very beginning, when we first have some initial scientific results, there might be a 99.99% chance at that point, before you've even begun the FDA clinical trials process, of losing all your money, and there might be some slim chance that the molecule will wind up becoming a successful drug, in which case the company might make millions or billions of dollars. So you might think about events or things that the firm might undertake over time that would shift this outcome distribution. So let's say that the company recruits an experienced key executive to the team. This might increase the chances of a successful outcome and decrease the chances of losing everything. But are there other types of strategies that the firm might think about that would have a more significant impact on altering this outcome distribution? In the Sirtus case, they had another strategic option. They could use the same scientific insights to produce a nutraceutical, to produce basically over-the-counter dosage of sirtuins, and this would decrease the likelihood that they would lose everything and give more of an intermediate outcome, where they'd have a much greater likelihood of making at least some small amount of money. But going into nutraceuticals could potentially cast a shadow over the firm's more legitimate business of making a new pharmaceutical drug, and so it might potentially have decreased the likelihood of a very successful outcome. Another twist to the business model that they considered experimenting with would be licensing in or licensing out some related compounds and molecules. So in addition to the particular sirtuin molecule that they were looking at, there were some additional families of molecules that they could either license out to others and generate some revenue, or perhaps license in and have a second shot at making a successful drug. And so this would give more of an intermediate outcome. And so these are the types of strategic choices and really experiments in the business model that can help entrepreneurs to manage the risk that they're facing and to take more calculated risks. So in order to gain more in-depth insights into entrepreneurship, we want to collect some data. And so the data set that I'm going to talk about initially comes from an alumni survey of all 105,000 MIT alumni. This then generated 43,000 responses, of which we have about 2,000 entrepreneurs in the data set. We've matched this up with the patent database and venture capital database and so on. So if you aggregate together all of this experimentation in the economy, it winds up having an extremely significant economic impact on the local and global economy. So the surviving firms that MIT alumni have created over the years have generated about 25,000 active companies, 3.3 million new jobs, and almost $2 trillion in worldwide sales and revenue. And so there's much more detail about this data and a lot more descriptive statistics in this report, Entrepreneurial Impact, the Role of MIT, which you can go and take a closer look at. But next I wanted to talk a little bit about data that comes from China. And I got interested in studying entrepreneurship in China because I think the rise of China as an economic superpower is going to be one of the significant events of my generation. And so I worked with Tsinghua University to generate a similar alumni survey out of the alumni from Tsinghua University in China, where we can match up the data with the MIT alumni survey. So here we have about 3,000 surveys that were returned, and this is what the survey looked like, written in Chinese. This is the locations of just the entrepreneurial respondents, so fairly wide distribution around China. And entrepreneurship has been increasing a lot, actually, over the years in the Chinese context, in the Chinese setting. And looking at the industry breakdown, we see it's very similar to that of MIT. Some small percentage of drugs or medical devices, but a lot of software and electronics. However, one interesting thing that comes out of this comparison is that when we look in particular at biotech and drugs, you see that for the Tsinghua sample, we have almost no exports. And so one interesting thing to look at and that we might examine in future studies is why do we see these differences in the level of exports amongst new startup companies in various industries across the two countries. So the MIT firms, a lot of these biotech and medical devices firms are generating exports and sales from exports. So I'm going to skip over this in the interest of time. So one of the questions that I've asked out of this data set is, how do we attract the best and the brightest to entrepreneurship? And one of the things that I've concluded from this is that we have too much focus on lowering the barriers to entry in this sort of let a thousand flowers bloom model of entrepreneurship. What we really want is that we want to increase, if we want to get more successful entrepreneurship, we want to increase the level of talent flowing into entrepreneurship. And to do that, we have to increase the returns to talent. And so how do we increase the returns to talent in entrepreneurship? There are policies that can be pursued at the national level or at the state level that might lower barriers to growth. When firms grow larger, then this is going to tend to benefit those who have higher levels of talent and attract more highly talented individuals into entrepreneurship. So in the Chinese context, we have a reform which is essentially ease the constraints on growth, where previously China had put a lot of policies in bringing in foreign direct investment, but that had really been discriminatory towards private entrepreneurial firms. And this reform was meant to reverse that and to reduce some of the restrictions on the growth of private firms. And so the effect of this is that we see, after the reform, we saw significantly more high human capital individuals becoming entrepreneurs. And we did in fact see the growth rates go up. So a little bit before and just after the reform, the size of entrepreneurial ventures increased significantly. So I've already talked about I've already talked a bit about how entrepreneurship is about calculated risk. And so I did that by talking about how we can think of experimenting with the business model and how we might draw in the best and the brightest, the most highly talented individuals to take calculated risks and experiment with new ventures in the economy. The other way that we can get people to take more calculated risk is by having some flexibility in the institutions in society. This is another study that comes out of the China data set. Here we looked at a reform in the curriculum at Tsinghua University. And this reform made it easier for students to choose their classes according to their interests. So they moved from the academic year system to the credit system, and they got the ability to take classes across disciplines much more and to pursue their interests across by having more choice and more flexibility in the classes that they could pursue. What we saw is that this increased the likelihood that these individuals, these graduates, would eventually become entrepreneurs and found firms. And it particularly increased the likelihood amongst those who had lower GPA. And so the theory here is that to become an entrepreneur, you have to be willing to question assumptions, and you have to be willing to pursue your interests even when they are at odds with the sort of training that you might be more familiar with. And so if you're able to combine insights from, say, chemistry with physics, then you might be more likely to find an entrepreneurial opportunity at these boundaries of fields. And so this flexibility in institutions, I believe, is generalizable beyond just the curriculum. Even companies in Silicon Valley, such as Google, are providing their employees with some flex time, some percentage of their time where they can pursue their own projects and go after their own interests. And so I think this is likely to spur further entrepreneurial behavior. Then next, what I wanted to talk about is a study that we've done, another study that we've done in the Chinese context. where we look at the influence of increasing funding for basic research. And so in this study, we looked at a natural experiment that came out of a policy change called China's Project 985. The 985 project essentially significantly increased the funding to a certain set of universities for more basic research. And so what my co-authors and I have been trying to look at is how did this increase in funding for basic research influence entrepreneurship? Did the alumni who attended these universities tend to start more high-tech firms, and if so, were those firms more successful? And so what we find is that the firms that came out of these Project 985 universities were more innovative. They were using more technology. However, they had lower revenues. And so I think the takeaway from this is that innovation and entrepreneurship isn't just about new technology. That new technology is a part of it, but that new technology can't just be brought into the market without an understanding of how to commercialize technology, if there are customers who are really ready to buy, if partners will really work with you. These other aspects of the business model have to be worked out in order for technology to successfully be commercialized and brought out of the lab. The final thing that I wanted to talk about is failure. Failure is a key aspect of entrepreneurship. Here I'm using data that comes from Japan. My co-authors and I are looking at reform in the Japanese bankruptcy system, which made it less punitive for individuals to go through the bankruptcy process. So the Japanese bankruptcy laws before 2003 were quite harsh. There was very little to no protection of personal assets. You couldn't work through a bankruptcy and restructure and still run the firm. The top management team had to be fired, and the process was quite slow. And so this reform in 2003 was meant to change all this, and it sped up the process, protected the entrepreneur's personal assets, and allowed them to remain in charge of the firm. So what we found from this is that it had the counterintuitive effect of increasing startup growth rates. And you see in particular the top 95th percentile of firms grew at a significantly faster rate after the reform as compared to before. And so we think this is for several reasons. One reason is that more highly talented individuals were then drawn into entrepreneurship because the risk was reduced. And these are individuals who had more at risk to potentially lose. Second reason is that they went after a set of opportunities that was higher risk and thus higher reward. And the third reason is that they may have changed their management style, managing less to avoid failure and more to generate growth. And so the takeaway from this paper is that you can lowering entry barriers can shape whether you can start a firm, but lowering the barriers to failure determines whether you would want to start one, particularly for the most highly talented individuals in the society. And so I think the whole world is beginning to wake up to the fact that entrepreneurship is a key driver of economic growth and of increases in the quality of life, and is trying to work out how do you create an environment that enables and fosters high growth, high tech entrepreneurship. And so this is some of what I've been working on in my own research and what I hope to have provided you with some insights towards. And a lot of these were geared at sort of public policy, but I think you can take a similar spirit and similar ideas and apply them at the firm level as well. So if you want to increase entrepreneurial behavior amongst your employees, you might think about how do you increase the returns to talent within your company? How do you make sure that people who are taking big risks aren't stigmatized by failure, but instead are rewarded when they're successful? How do you increase the flexibility of your company's policies and practices? Are there ways you can institute some kind of flex time or rotation amongst managers to expose them more to different parts of the business? How might you allow people to pursue their own interests and their own motivations more? So, in conclusion, I think we need to think about how to enable experimentation in the economy by the best and the brightest. I think there's a lot of opportunities to actually take advantage of perhaps the relative lack of traditions in biotech and life sciences to experiment with new business models and new cutting-edge technologies. And to do this, we need to encourage failure, we need to generate more flexibility in the institutions, and bring in talent by sharing the rewards with them. One last thing. Most of you might recognize the man on the right as Alfred P. Sloan, chief executive of General Motors, but you might not recognize the man on the left. That's William C. Durant. He was actually the initial founder who created the business model and started to scale it up. And managing a large company versus creating a new company and experimenting with a new business model, searching for a successful business model, these are fundamentally different activities that require a different set of skills and a different way of training. So that's partly what I'm trying to get at and what I want to emphasize here, that we have business schools that are very good at training executives to manage a known, well understood business model. But we need to begin to understand how to encourage, support, and train those who undertake the important activity of experimenting in the economy and searching for brand new business models. And this may require a whole new type of entrepreneurship school, either in the university or a set of training within companies. One final thought that I want to leave you with, which is that people can accomplish any what if only they believe in the why. And I think in applying these ideas in entrepreneurship and the life sciences, which I hope you'll take some time to think about, the important thing is really that this is an industry that benefits human quality of life. And so I think while the challenges are great and the difficulties are high, if we manage to be successful in this sector, it has a huge impact on people's standard of living and health. And so I think that's what's incredibly, incredibly important about figuring this stuff out. So thank you all very much for your attention, and hopefully I've left you with some thoughts about how life sciences entrepreneurship can be stimulated by thinking about experimentation in the business model, taking calculated risks, and reducing the penalties to failure. Thank you very much.